Terminally ill child has one last wish to see George Strait. What happens next touches the world. The silence in room 312 of Children's Medical Center in Dallas was broken only by the steady beep of machines that had become Tommy Reynolds's constant companions. At 8 years old, most children would be complaining about homework or begging for another hour of video games. Tommy Reynolds was learning words that no child should ever have to understand. Glioblastoma, inoperable, terminal. The tumor, nestled deep in his brain, had a name longer than most of the country songs he loved. But unlike those melodies that brought him comfort, this diagnosis offered no happy endings. 3 months, that's what Dr. Martinez had told his mother, Sarah, in the hallway outside his room, just 48 hours ago. 3 months to fit a lifetime of dreams, hopes, and love into a space smaller than a single season. But if you walked into Tommy's room right now, you wouldn't see a dying child. You'd see a little cowboy, his grandfather's weathered Stetson perched carefully on his bald head, where thick brown curls once danced in the Texas wind. The chemotherapy had taken his hair, but it couldn't touch the spirit that blazed in his. Green eyes every time the opening chords of Amarillo by Morning filled the sterile air around him. Amarillo Morning, up from San Antone. Tommy's voice, though weakened by treatments, carried every note with the precision of someone who had studied the song like scripture. His small fingers moved across an imaginary guitar, and for those 3 minutes and 32 seconds, he wasn't a patient in a children's hospital. He was riding through the Texas Panhandle, free as the wind that George Strait sang about with such poetry. The worn CD player beside his bed had been a gift from his late grandfather, along with the complete discography of the king of country, music himself. Tommy's mother, Sarah, often wondered if her father had somehow known that these songs would become her son's anchor when the storms of life threatened to pull him under. Every morning, as the nurses prepared his medication and the doctors made their rounds, Tommy would close his eyes and let George Strait's voice transport him to a world where 8-year-old boys could be cowboys, where every sunrise brought new adventures, and where the music never had to end. If you're watching this story unfold and finding yourself moved by Tommy's courage, we'd love to have you join our community. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what stories touch your heart the most. Your support helps us share more inspiring tales like Tommy's with people who need to hear them. Sarah Reynolds had always been a fighter, but nothing in her 28 years had prepared her for this battle. Single motherhood had taught her to stretch every dollar, work multiple jobs, and find strength she didn't know existed. But watching her son face each day with a smile while poison coursed through his veins to fight an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with or bargained away had redefined her understanding of what true courage looked like. She remembered the day Tommy first heard George Strait's music. He was 5 years old, sitting in his grandfather's pickup truck, when Check Yes or No came on the radio. Within seconds, Tommy was tapping his feet and asking his grandfather to play it again, and again, and again. By the time they reached home, Tommy had memorized every word, and Sarah's father had found his fishing and storytelling companion for every weekend that followed. Those weekends seemed like another lifetime now. Sarah's father had passed away just 6 months before Tommy's diagnosis, leaving behind a legacy of country music, fishing tales, and the unshakable belief that every problem had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough to find it. Tommy wore his grandfather's hat not just as a fashion statement, but as armor against a world that had suddenly become far too complicated and frightening for someone who should have been worried about Little League Baseball and which cartoon to watch after school. The first time Tommy mentioned his wish to meet George Strait, Sarah thought it was just the innocent dream of a child who loved music. Children often fantasized about meeting their heroes. But as the weeks passed and Tommy's condition worsened, she began to understand that this wasn't just a wish, it was hope in its purest form. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still magic in the world. Hope that the man whose voice had carried Tommy through his darkest hours might somehow appear and make everything better, the way heroes did in the stories his grandfather used to tell. The social worker from the Children's Wish Foundation had seemed optimistic when Tommy first shared his dream. "We've arranged meetings with athletes, movie stars, even presidents," she'd said with the kind of professional confidence that came from years of making impossible things happen. "I'm sure we can reach Mr. Strait's representatives and work something out." But George Strait, as Tommy and Sarah would soon learn, wasn't like other celebrities. He didn't have an army of publicists and managers scheduling every minute of his day. He didn't do celebrity appearances or charity photo opportunities as a matter of routine. The king of country music had earned his crown through decades of authentic storytelling and genuine connection with his fans, but he protected his privacy with the same intensity that he brought to his music. Days turned into weeks, and the foundation's calls went unanswered. George Strait's representatives were polite but firm. Mr. Strait was taking time away from public appearances and wasn't accepting new requests for meetings or performances. They offered autographed merchandise, concert recordings, even a personal letter from the country star himself. But Tommy's eyes, already dimmed by the daily battle raging inside his small body, grew a little sadder each time Sarah had to explain that his hero wouldn't be coming to visit. Meanwhile, the medical reports grew more urgent. The tumor that doctors had hoped might respond to aggressive treatment showed no signs of shrinking. In fact, Dr. Martinez's latest scans suggested it was growing faster than they had initially projected. The 3-month timeline that had once seemed impossibly short now felt optimistic. Tommy's body was growing weaker, his appetite diminishing, and the periods between his pain medication were becoming harder to endure. It was during one of these difficult nights, when Tommy couldn't sleep despite the morphine drip, that nurse, Jennifer Walsh, made a decision that would change everything. She had been caring for pediatric patients for over 15 years, but something about Tommy's unwavering spirit in the face of such overwhelming odds had touched her deeply. As she watched him mouth the words to "I cross my heart" while staring at the ceiling, she quietly pulled out her phone and began recording. The video was less than 3 minutes long, but it captured something extraordinary. Tommy, his small frame dwarfed by the hospital bed, his grandfather's hat slightly askew on his head, was singing with a passion that seemed to emanate from his very soul. His voice was weak, interrupted occasionally by the oxygen cannula, but every word carried the weight of someone who understood that music wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. "I cross my heart and promise to give all I've got to give to make all your dreams come true." Tommy sang, his eyes closed, completely lost in the moment. When he reached the final chorus, tears were streaming down his cheeks, but his voice never wavered. This wasn't a performance. It was a prayer set to music, a conversation with the hero he might never meet. Jennifer Walsh posted the video on her personal social media account that night with a simple caption, "This is why we do what we do." Tommy Reynolds, 8 years old, terminal brain cancer, singing for his hero, George Strait. Please share and help us make his dream come true. Let Tommy meet George. She had 300 followers, mostly family and fellow nurses. She never expected what happened next. By morning, the video had been shared over 10,000 times. By noon, it was trending on multiple platforms. The hashtag #LetTommyMeetGeorge was spreading faster than wildfire through dry Texas grass, catching the attention of country music fans, celebrities, and complete strangers who were moved by the sight of a dying child finding hope in music. Sarah woke up to her phone buzzing with notifications from friends, relatives, and people she'd never met, all sharing the video of her son. Part of her felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to retreat into the privacy of their hospital room and protect Tommy from the attention. But as she watched the comments pour in, messages of love, support, prayers and determination to help make Tommy's dream come true, she realized that something powerful was happening. Tommy's courage was inspiring others to believe in the possibility of miracles, and sometimes, Sarah thought as she watched her son sleep peacefully for the first time in days, miracles needed a little help from an army of strangers who refused to give up hope. But 800 miles away, on a sprawling ranch outside San Antonio, the man at the center of this growing storm had no idea that his life was about to be changed by an 8-year-old boy who believed that country music could heal anything, even a broken heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Strait family ranch as George Harvey Strait Jr. stood on his front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching his horses graze in the distance. At 73 years old, the king of country music had earned the right to enjoy his mornings in peace, away from the demands of touring, recording, and the constant pressure of maintaining a legend's reputation. He had given the world more than 40 years of his voice, his heart, and his soul. Now he was content to give his time to the things that had always mattered most: his family, his land, and the simple pleasures that didn't require spotlights or standing ovations. The decision to step back from public life hadn't been easy. For decades, George had been the most consistent presence in country music, releasing album after album, selling out arena after arena, never missing a show or disappointing a fan. But the death of his son Jennifer in a car accident in 1986 had changed him in ways that the public never fully understood. Music had been his healing, but it had also been his burden, carrying the weight of other people's emotions while trying to process his own grief. His wife, Norma, had been the one to suggest the extended break. "You've given everyone else your heart for so long," she'd said one evening as they sat on this same porch watching the sun set over the Texas landscape. "Maybe it's time to give some of that heart back to yourself." And so, after his final scheduled tour dates, George had come home to the ranch and tried to remember who he was when he wasn't performing for thousands of people every night. The phone calls from his management team had started almost immediately. Concert promoters wanted him back on tour, record labels wanted new albums, television producers wanted him for specials and award shows. But George had made his decision. His assistant, Maria Gonzalez, had strict instructions: no new commitments, no interviews, no public appearances. He was tired of being George Strait, the icon. He wanted to remember what it felt like to just be George. Maria had been fielding these requests for months when the calls about Tommy Reynolds started coming in. At first, they seemed like any other charity request, worthy causes that George's representatives handled with polite declinations and standard responses about Mr. Strait's current unavailability for public appearances. The Children's Wish Foundation was persistent but professional, explaining the situation and hoping that perhaps an exception could be made for such a deserving case. "It's another sick child wanting to meet George," Maria had mentioned to Norma during one of their weekly check-ins about ranch business and correspondence. "Sweet story, but you know how George feels about these requests right now. He's still processing everything with the tour ending and wanting his privacy." Norma had nodded sympathetically. They both understood George's need for space, his desire to heal from decades of giving pieces of himself to strangers. But something about the repeated calls made her curious. "What makes this one different?" she had asked. "They don't usually call this many times." Maria had pulled out her notes. 8-year-old boy named Tommy Reynolds, brain cancer, terminal. Apparently he's obsessed with George's music, particularly Amarillo by Morning. The foundation says it's his dying wish to meet George and hear him sing that song in person. The request had tugged at something in Norma's heart, but she respected her husband's boundaries. George had given so much of himself over the years, had carried the grief and joy of millions of fans, had been the soundtrack to countless lives and loves and losses. He deserved this time to breathe, to exist without the weight of other people's expectations, but the calls kept coming. And then the letters started arriving, not just from the foundation, but from friends and family of the Reynolds family. Local radio DJs in Dallas began mentioning Tommy's story on air. Country music blogs picked up the tale of the dying boy who found comfort in George Strait's voice during his chemotherapy sessions. George remained blissfully unaware of the growing attention. He spent his days checking on cattle, riding his favorite horse Thunder across the property, and working on small projects around the ranch that had been neglected during years of constant travel. Evenings were spent with Norma, watching old movies or reading books that had nothing to do with music or fame or the entertainment industry. It was his old friend and former roadie, Jake Martinez, who finally broke through the protective barrier that had been carefully constructed around George's private world. Jake had worked with George's crew for nearly 20 years before retiring to run a small music store in Austin. He wasn't supposed to have George's personal number, but their friendship had transcended professional boundaries long ago. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late October, just as George and Norma were finishing dinner. George almost didn't answer. He'd been enjoying the quiet rhythm of ranch life and had grown accustomed to letting the answering machine handle most calls. But something about seeing Jake's name on the caller ID made him pick up. "George, I'm sorry to bother you at home." Jake's voice carried an urgency that immediately caught George's attention. "I know you're trying to stay out of the spotlight, and I respect that, man, I really do, but there's something you need to see." George had known Jake long enough to recognize when his old friend was genuinely troubled about something. "What's going on, Jake?" "There's a video that's been making the rounds online. A little boy in a hospital singing your songs. George, I've seen a lot of things in this business, but this kid is something special, and he's dying." The words hung in the air between them. George felt something shift in his chest, a familiar ache that he'd been trying to avoid for months. "Jake, you know I can't—" "I'm not asking you to do anything," Jake interrupted gently. "I'm just asking you to watch the video. 3 minutes, George. Give me 3 minutes, and then if you want me to never mention it again, I'll respect that." George looked across the table at Norma, who'd been listening to his side of the conversation with growing concern. She nodded slightly, understanding passing between them in the way that only came after decades of marriage. "Send me the link," George said quietly. 30 minutes later, George Strait sat in his home office, staring at his computer screen, watching an 8-year-old boy in a hospital bed sing "I Cross My Heart" with more emotion and authenticity than many professional performers could muster. Tommy's thin voice carried every note with the precision of someone who had studied not just the melody, but the meaning behind every word. As the video played, George found himself remembering why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about fame or fortune or sold-out arenas. It was about connection, the magical moment when a song reached out and touched someone's soul in a way that nothing else could. Watching Tommy sing, seeing the peace that settled over the child's face as he lost himself in the music, George was reminded of music's most fundamental power, its ability to heal, to comfort, to transform suffering into something beautiful. The video ended, but George continued staring at the screen. In Tommy's face, he saw every fan who had ever told him that his music had helped them through a difficult time. He saw his own son, Jennifer, who had loved music and life with the same innocent passion. He saw himself as a young man, dreaming of making music that mattered, music that could make a difference in people's lives. Norma appeared in the doorway, having given him space to process whatever Jake had shown him. "George, you okay?" He turned to look at his wife, and she saw something in his eyes that had been missing for months. purpose. "Norma, I need to make some phone calls." "To who?" George stood up, his decision crystallizing with each word he spoke. "To a little boy who needs to know that his heroes are real, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, they show up when we need them most." But even as George reached for his phone to call his assistant, he had no idea that at that very moment, 800 miles away, a desperate mother was making a decision that would bring Tommy Reynolds directly to his doorstep, with or without an invitation. Sarah Reynolds had reached the end of her patience with phone calls and representatives and polite rejections. Her son was dying. And sometimes, she had decided, you had to take matters into your own hands. The collision course between a reclusive country music legend and a dying boy's last wish was about to become inevitable, and neither of them realized how profoundly their lives were about to change each other. Sarah Reynolds had always prided herself on being a practical woman. Single motherhood had taught her to plan ahead, save money, and never make impulsive decisions that could jeopardize her son's future. But as she sat in the cramped hospital cafeteria at 2 o'clock in the morning, staring at her phone screen filled with thousands of comments on Tommy's viral video, practicality felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The latest medical report had been devastating. Dr. Martinez had pulled her aside after Tommy's afternoon scan, his usually optimistic demeanor replaced by the careful gentleness that medical professionals reserved for the most difficult conversations. The tumor had grown significantly in just 2 weeks. The aggressive treatment that had bought them precious months was no longer working. The timeline they had been given was no longer measured in months or even weeks. "I want to be honest with you, Sarah," Dr. Martinez had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy is incredibly strong, but his body is beginning to shut down. We're looking at days, maybe a week or 2 at most. I think it's time to focus on comfort care and making sure he has everything he needs to be at peace." Peace. The word had echoed in Sarah's mind for hours. How could there be peace when her 8-year-old son's greatest dream remained unfulfilled? How could she let Tommy slip away, knowing that the one person who could bring him true joy was living just a few hours away, probably unaware that a little boy was dying while singing his songs? The social media response to Tommy's video had been overwhelming. Celebrities were sharing the hashtag, news outlets were picking up the story, politicians were calling for George Strait to respond. But all of the attention in the world meant nothing if it didn't reach the one person who mattered. And as the hours ticked by without any word from Strait's camp, Sarah felt desperation creeping into the spaces where hope used to live. She had tried calling the foundation again that afternoon, but the news wasn't encouraging. "We've submitted the request through every possible channel," the coordinator had explained with genuine sympathy. "Mr. Strait's representatives have been contacted multiple times. Unfortunately, he's not accepting any new meeting requests during his hiatus from public appearances. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Reynolds. We're still trying, but I don't want to give you false hope, as if there were any other kind when your child was dying." That's when Sarah made the decision that would have seemed insane to the practical woman she had been just months ago. She was going to take Tommy to George Strait, whether he was expecting them or not. If the mountain wouldn't come to Muhammad, then Muhammad would have to find a way to the mountain, even if it meant using every dollar she had left in the world. The logistics were complicated and expensive. Tommy was too weak to travel by plane, and the medical equipment he needed made commercial transportation impossible. Sarah spent the early morning hours researching medical transport services, calling companies, and watching her small savings account evaporate with each phone call. A medical van from Dallas to San Antonio would cost more than she made in 3 months, But what was money compared to her son's dying wish? By dawn, she had liquidated everything she could. Her car was sold to a neighbor for far less than it was worth, but the cash would help cover the transport costs. Her mother's jewelry, which she had planned to save for Tommy's future wife, went to a pawn shop. The small emergency fund she had been building for years disappeared into the growing pile of medical bills and travel expenses. "Mom, what are you doing?" Tommy had asked weakly when he woke up to find her packing their few belongings into a duffel bag. His voice was barely audible, and the effort of speaking seemed to exhaust him. Sarah sat on the edge of his bed and took his small hand in hers. "We're going on a trip, baby, a special trip." Tommy's eyes, though dimmed by medication and fatigue, showed a flicker of curiosity. "Where are we going?" Sarah had practiced this moment in her mind, but actually saying the words still made her heart race with a mixture of terror and determination. "We're going to see George Strait." For the first time in weeks, Tommy's face lit up with something that resembled his old smile. "Really? He's coming here?" "No, sweetheart. We're going to him, to his ranch in Texas." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him processing this information with the strange wisdom that seemed to come to children who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "Does he know we're coming?" Sarah hesitated. She had always been honest with Tommy, even when the truth was difficult. "Not yet, baby, but sometimes the best surprises are the ones that come from the heart." The medical transport van arrived at noon on a grey October day that felt heavy with the weight of impending change. The driver, a kind man named Miguel, who had been transporting sick children for over a decade, helped Tommy into the specially equipped vehicle with the gentleness of someone who understood that every movement might cause pain. "You sure about this, Mrs. Reynolds?" Miguel had asked quietly as they loaded Tommy's medical equipment. "San Antonio is a long way, and ranch country can be pretty isolated. What if this George Strait fellow isn't home? What if he won't see you?" Sarah looked back at her son, who was already closing his eyes and humming softly to himself in the back of the van. "Then at least Tommy will know that we tried everything, that his mum didn't give up on his dream." The drive to San Antonio took 8 hours, with multiple stops for Tommy's medication and to give him time to rest. Each mile that passed felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat, bringing them closer to either the fulfillment of her son's greatest wish or the most expensive and heartbreaking mistake of her life. As they drove through the Texas countryside, Tommy spent most of the journey listening to George Strait's music on his headphones, occasionally singing along in a voice that grew weaker with each passing hour. Sarah watched him in the rearview mirror, memorizing every moment, every expression, knowing that regardless of what happened when they reached their destination, this might be one of their last adventures together. Meanwhile, 3 hours ahead of their journey, George Strait was having a very different kind of afternoon. After watching Tommy's video the night before, he had spent the morning making phone calls that he hadn't made in months. His first call had been to Maria, his assistant, who was shocked to hear from him directly rather than through Norma. "Maria, I need you to find me some information about a little boy named Tommy Reynolds," George had said, his voice carrying a determination that she hadn't heard since before his hiatus. "He's in a hospital in Dallas, and I think he needs to meet me." Maria had been quiet for a moment, clearly processing this sudden change in her boss's position. "Mr. Strait, are you sure? You've been so clear about maintaining your privacy. If word gets out that you're making exceptions—" "Let me worry about that," George had interrupted gently. "Right now, I need to focus on a little boy who's running out of time." The next few hours had been a whirlwind of activity that the ranch hadn't seen in months. George had contacted the Children's Hospital in Dallas, only to be told that Tommy Reynolds had been discharged that morning against medical advice. His mother had signed him out, and they had left no forwarding information beyond a vague mention of going to Texas. George's attempts to reach Sarah Reynolds directly had been unsuccessful. Her phone seemed to be turned off, and the foundation that had been trying to arrange the meeting had no idea where she and Tommy had gone. It was as if they had simply vanished into the vastness of Texas, chasing a dream that might never become reality. As the afternoon wore on, George found himself pacing his front porch, checking his phone repeatedly, and feeling a growing sense of urgency that he hadn't experienced in years. Somewhere out there, a dying child was looking for him, and he had no way to reach out and say, "I'm here, I'm ready, I want to meet you too." Norma watched her husband's restless energy with a mixture of concern and admiration. "George, you can't save every sick child in the world. You tried to reach out, but if they've disappeared..." "This isn't about saving anyone," George replied, stopping his pacing to look out at the long driveway that led to their ranch. "This is about showing up when it matters. That little boy has been showing up for me every day, singing my songs, finding strength in music when everything else was failing him. The least I can do is show up for him." As the sun began to set over the Strait ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have inspired a dozen country songs, George made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his security team and gave them instructions that went against every protocol they had established for protecting his privacy. "If anyone shows up at the gate asking about Tommy Reynolds or looking for me because of a sick child, you bring them directly to the house. No questions asked." His head of security, a former police officer named Bill Crawford, was clearly uncomfortable with this deviation from standard procedure. "Mr. Strait, we don't usually allow unannounced visitors. What if it's someone pretending to be this family? What if it's media trying to get access?" George was quiet for a moment, watching the last light of day fade behind the hills. "Bill, sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. Sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones you never see coming." What George didn't know was that at that exact moment, a medical transport van was pulling through the gates of San Antonio, carrying a dying boy and his desperate mother who had risked everything on the hope that heroes sometimes lived up to their legends. The stars were beginning to appear in the vast Texas sky when Miguel's van finally turned onto the long dirt road that led to the Strait family ranch. Tommy had been asleep for the last hour, his small body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of the journey, but Sarah was wide awake, her heart pounding as they approached the place where her son's greatest dream might finally come true or be forever broken. The ranch gates stood tall and imposing in the headlights, a barrier between the desperate hope that had carried them 800 miles and the reality of what they were about to attempt. Sarah had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times during the drive, but now that they were here, her carefully planned words seemed to evaporate like morning dew under the Texas sun. Miguel brought the van to a stop in front of the security booth, where a uniformed guard emerged with the professional wariness of someone accustomed to turning away unwanted visitors. Sarah's stomach clenched as she watched the man approach. In their vehicle, his flashlight casting long shadows across the ground. "Good evening, folks," the guard said, his tone polite but firm. "This is private property. Are you lost? The main highway is about 5 miles back the way you came." Sarah rolled down her window, her mouth suddenly dry as cotton. "I'm Sarah Reynolds. This is my son, Tommy. We've come to see George Strait." The guard's expression shifted slightly, and Sarah caught something that might have been recognition in his eyes. "Reynolds, did you say Tommy Reynolds?" "Yes," Sarah managed, hardly believing that he seemed to know the name. "My son is very sick, and meeting Mr. Strait is his last wish. I know we don't have an appointment, but—" "Ma'am, please, wait right here," the guard interrupted, already reaching for his radio. "Mr. Crawford, it's Bill at the front gate. I've got Sarah and Tommy Reynolds here. Yes, sir, the family from Dallas. They're here. Sarah felt her heart stop. How could they possibly know who they were? How could George Strait's security team be expecting them when she hadn't been able to reach anyone connected to the country star? The guard returned to their window with an expression that was completely different from the one he'd worn moments before. Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Strait has been waiting for you. Please follow the road straight ahead to the main house. Someone will be there to meet you. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. He's been waiting for us, but how did he know we were coming? I think that's a conversation you'll need to have with Mr. Strait himself, ma'am. Drive safe now, and welcome to the ranch. As Miguel drove through the now open gates, Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached back to gently wake Tommy, her hands shaking with a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. Tommy, baby, wake up. We're here. Tommy's eyes fluttered open, still heavy with sleep and medication. Are we home, Mom? No, sweetheart. We're at George Strait's ranch, and he's waiting to meet you. The transformation in Tommy's face was immediate and miraculous. Despite his weakness, despite the pain that had been his constant companion for months, his eyes suddenly blazed with the kind of pure joy that Sarah hadn't seen since before his diagnosis. Really? He really wants to meet me? Yes, baby. He really wants to meet you. The main house appeared ahead of them, a sprawling ranch-style home that managed to be both grand and welcoming. Warm light spilled from the windows, and Sarah could see figures moving on the front porch. As they drew closer, she recognized the unmistakable silhouette of the man whose voice had carried her son through the darkest days of his young life. George Strait stood on his porch, his hands in his pockets, watching their approach with an expression of nervous anticipation that Sarah had never seen in any of his publicity photos. He looked older than she had expected, the lines around his eyes speaking of decades of experience, but there was something in his posture that reminded her of Tommy, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty, as if he too was about to embark on something that would change him forever. Norma Strait appeared beside her husband, her presence radiating the kind of maternal warmth that Sarah recognized immediately. Behind them stood a man in a security uniform who Sarah assumed must be the Mr. Crawford who had been contacted at the gate. Miguel brought the van to a gentle stop, and before Sarah could even unbuckle her seatbelt, George Strait was walking toward their vehicle with the unhurried but purposeful stride of a man who had finally found something he'd been searching. For without knowing it, Sarah climbed out of the van first, her legs unsteady after the long journey. She found herself face to face with a legend, but all she could see was a man whose eyes held the same mixture of hope and fear that she had been carrying for months. Mrs. Reynolds. George's voice was exactly as she had heard it on countless recordings, but somehow more intimate, more real. I'm George Strait. I know who you are, Sarah whispered, still hardly believing this moment was happening. I can't believe you're here. I can't believe you knew we were coming. George smiled, and Sarah understood immediately why Tommy had fallen in love with this man's music. There was something authentic about him, something that spoke of integrity and genuine kindness. Well, I have to admit, I was hoping you'd show up. You see, there's a little boy I've been wanting to meet. Miguel was already preparing Tommy's wheelchair, carefully transferring the medical equipment they would need for this visit. Tommy was awake now, his eyes wide, as he took in the scene around him. When he saw George Strait approaching the van, his small hand reached instinctively for his grandfather's hat, adjusting it with the serious concentration of someone preparing to meet royalty. George reached the van just as Miguel was helping Tommy into his wheelchair. For a moment, the country music legend and the dying boy simply looked at each other, both of them processing the magnitude of this meeting that had seemed impossible just days before. "Are you Tommy?" George asked, his voice gentler than Sarah had ever heard it on any recording. "Yes, sir. Tommy replied, his own voice barely above a whisper, but clear and strong. "Are you really George Strait?" "I really am," George said, kneeling down so that he was at Tommy's eye level. "And I understand you know some of my songs." Tommy's face lit up with the first genuine smile Sarah had seen in weeks. "I know all of them, every single one." "Well, that makes you smarter than me," George chuckled, "because sometimes I forget the words to my own songs." Tommy giggled, a sound that Sarah had almost forgotten her son could make. "That's silly. How can you forget your own words?" "You'd be surprised," George said, standing up and gesturing toward the house. "Would you like to come inside? I've got my guitar with me, and I was hoping maybe you could help me remember how Amarillo by morning goes." Tommy looked up at his mother with an expression of pure disbelief. "Mom, did you hear that? George Strait wants me to help him remember his song." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm her. This was already more than she had dared to hope for. Tommy wasn't just meeting his hero was treating him like an equal, like someone whose opinion mattered. As they made their way toward the house, George walked beside Tommy's wheelchair, asking him questions about his favorite songs and listening to the boy's answers with the kind of attention that most adults reserved for other adults. Norma fell into step beside Sarah, offering silent support with her presence. "I hope you don't mind us just showing up like this," Sarah said quietly to George as they reached the front porch. "I know you value your privacy, and I never would have come if Mrs. Reynolds," George interrupted gently, "some things are more important than privacy, and meeting this young man is definitely one of them." Inside the house, Sarah was struck by how normal everything felt. Despite the fame and success that George had achieved, his home felt like a family home. Comfortable furniture, family photos, the kind of lived-in warmth that spoke of real life rather than celebrity showcase. George retrieved his guitar from a corner of the living room, the instrument showing the wear and scratches that came from decades of use. As he settled into a chair across from Tommy, Sarah noticed that his hands, though still steady, carried the slight tremor that came with age. "Now, Tommy," George said, adjusting the guitar on his knee, "I want you to know that I've heard you sing. A friend of mine showed me a video of you performing I Cross My Heart in the hospital." Tommy's eyes widened. "You saw me sing?" "I did. And I have to tell you something important," George continued, his voice taking on the serious tone of someone about to share a significant truth. "In all my years of making music, I've never heard anyone sing one of my songs with more heart than you did in that hospital room. You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the gravity of someone much older than his 8 years. "Music helps when things hurt," he said finally. "Your music makes the scary things less scary." George felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of his own experiences with grief and healing through music. "Yes, it does, and that's exactly what music is supposed to do." He began to play the opening chords of Amarillo by Morning, and immediately Tommy's face transformed. Despite his weakness, despite the medical equipment that surrounded him, despite everything that had brought them to this moment, Tommy began to sing along in a voice that carried the wisdom of someone who understood that music wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. "Amarillo Morning, up from San Antone, everything that I got is just what I've got on." George found himself harmonizing with the boy, their voices blending in a way that felt both natural and miraculous. As they sang together, Sarah watched, her son become the child he had been before cancer entered their lives, confident, joyful, completely lost in the moment. But what Sarah didn't know was that this was only the beginning. George Strait had plans for Tommy Reynolds that went far beyond a single evening of music. plans that would require him to step back into the spotlight he had been avoiding, plans that would test everything he thought he knew about legacy, purpose, and the power of a promise made to a dying child. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over the Strait Ranch, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Texas feel like the center of the universe. Tommy had spent the night in the ranch's guest room, surrounded by more comfort and luxury than he had experienced in months, but more importantly, surrounded by the knowledge that his hero had become his friend. George had stayed up most of the night, not because Tommy needed constant care. Sarah and the medical equipment Miguel had brought handled that, but because he found himself reluctant to end their time together. They had sung a dozen songs, shared stories about music and life, and Tommy had even taught George a few verses of songs that the boy had written himself during his hospital stays. "You know, Tommy," George had said as they wrapped up their impromptu concert around midnight, "I've been thinking about something. Would you like to help me with a special project?" Tommy's eyes had immediately brightened, despite his exhaustion. "What kind of project?" "Well, I haven't performed for a live audience in almost a year," George had explained, choosing his words carefully. "And I've been thinking that maybe it's time to do one more show, a very special show. Would you like to be my guest of honor?" The conversation that followed would change everything, not just for Tommy and Sarah, but for George himself. Over breakfast the next morning, as Tommy slowly ate the first full meal he had managed in weeks, George outlined his plan. "I want to organize a benefit concert," he announced to Sarah and Norma, his voice carrying the kind of determination that had built a legendary career. "Not just any concert. I want to bring together some of the biggest names in country music for one night, all to raise money for pediatric cancer research and to honor kids like Tommy who are fighting this battle." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "George, you don't have to do that. Just meeting Tommy was more than enough. You've already given us a miracle." "No, Mrs. Reynolds," George replied, his gaze moving between her and Tommy, who was listening intently despite his obvious fatigue. "You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing. Tommy reminded me why I started making music in the first place. The least I can do is use that music to help other kids like him." What happened next was like watching a master craftsman return to his trade after a long absence. George spent the morning making phone calls to agents, venues, and fellow musicians with the kind of focused energy that Norma hadn't seen since before his retirement. Within hours, he had secured the use of AT&T Stadium in Arlington for the following weekend, and had commitments from a dozen major country music stars to participate. But the most important call was the one he made to Dr. Martinez at Children's Medical Center in Dallas. "Doctor, this is George Strait," he said, ignoring the obvious shock in the physician's voice. "I understand you've been caring for a special young man named Tommy Reynolds. I have him here with me at my ranch, and I wanted to discuss his condition with you." The conversation that followed was sobering. Dr. Martinez confirmed what Sarah had been afraid to fully accept. Tommy's time was measured in days, possibly weeks if they were very fortunate. The tumor was advancing rapidly, and while Tommy seemed to have found new energy and purpose through meeting his hero, his body was still losing the battle. "I want to do something for him," George told the doctor. "Something that will matter, not just to Tommy, but to other children facing what he's facing. But I need to know, is he strong enough to attend a concert, to be on stage for a few minutes?" Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Strait, I can't make any guarantees about Tommy's condition from one day to the next, but I will say this. In my 20 years of treating pediatric cancer patients, I've learned that the human spirit can sometimes accomplish things that medical science says should be impossible. If anyone could find the strength to be part of something like what you're describing, it would be Tommy Reynolds. The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity that transformed the quiet ranch into a command center for what was being called Tommy's Concert across social media. The hashtag that had started as Let Tommy Meet George evolved into Young Tommy's Concert, and the response was overwhelming. Tickets for the event sold out in less than 3 hours, with all proceeds going to pediatric cancer research. Musicians who hadn't spoken to each other in years put aside old disagreements to be part of something bigger than themselves. Corporate sponsors lined up to contribute, and media outlets from around the world requested coverage rights. But through it all, the focus remained on Tommy. George insisted that every decision be run past the 8-year-old boy who had inspired this massive undertaking. Tommy, despite his declining physical condition, threw himself into the planning, with the enthusiasm of someone who finally had a purpose that extended beyond his own survival. "I want other kids to know that they're not alone," Tommy told George during one of their daily planning sessions. "I want them to know that even when things are really scary, there are people who care about them." 3 days before the concert, Tommy took a turn for the worse. His appetite disappeared completely, his energy levels plummeted, and Sarah found herself wondering if they were asking too much of her son's failing body. But when she suggested that maybe Tommy should skip the concert and rest, the boy's response surprised her. "Mom, this isn't just about me anymore," Tommy said with a maturity that took her breath away. "This is about all the kids who are going to be helped by the money we raise. This is about showing them that giving up isn't the only choice." The night of the concert arrived with all the fanfare and emotion that the week of preparation had promised. AT&T Stadium was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in aisles and sitting in every available space. The performance lineup read like a who's who of country music. Keith Urban, Carrie Underwood, Blake Shelton, Miranda Lambert, and dozens of others had all come together for one night to honor a boy most of them had never met, but all of them had come to love. Tommy arrived at the stadium in a specially equipped medical transport, accompanied by a full medical team that Dr. Martinez had assembled to ensure his safety throughout the evening. He was weaker than he had been at the ranch, but his eyes still held that spark of determination that had carried him through months of treatment. The concert itself was magical. Each performer dedicated their set to Tommy and to all the children fighting cancer, sharing stories of their own encounters with the disease and the importance of never giving up hope. The audience was moved to tears multiple times throughout the evening, but those were tears of inspiration rather than sadness. The culmination of the night came when George Strait took the stage for his first live performance in over a year. The crowd's reaction was thunderous, but George quickly quieted them with a gesture. "Tonight isn't about me," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the stadium. "Tonight is about a little boy who reminded me that music has the power to heal, to inspire, and to bring people together in ways that nothing else can. Tommy Reynolds, would you please join me on stage?" What happened next would be replayed on television and social media for months to come. Tommy, in his wheelchair but wearing a brand new cowboy hat that George had given him, was brought onto the stage to a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Despite his weakness, despite the medical equipment that accompanied him, Tommy's face radiated pure joy. "Tommy," George said, kneeling beside the wheelchair so that the two of them were at the same level, "you taught me something important. You taught me that heroes aren't the people on stage or in the movies. Heroes are the people who keep fighting when everything seems impossible. Heroes are the people who find ways to help others even when they're facing their own battles. You are the hero here tonight." Then together they sang Amarillo by Morning to an audience of 80,000 people, their voices blending in perfect harmony under the bright stadium lights. Tommy's voice, though weak, carried every note with the precision and passion that had first captured George's attention in that hospital video weeks earlier. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As the song ended and the applause thundered through the stadium, George made an announcement that no one, including Tommy and Sarah, had expected. Tonight, this concert has raised over $3 million for pediatric cancer research, he announced to wild cheering. But more than that, it has inspired something even bigger. I am announcing the creation of the Tommy Reynolds Foundation for pediatric cancer research, with an initial endowment of $10 million from my personal funds and ongoing support from many of the artists you've seen tonight. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tommy stared at George with wide eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what had just been announced. "But that's not all," George continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to share the most important news of all. 3 days ago, I received a call from Dr. Martinez in Dallas. "Tommy, your latest scans show something that no one expected. The tumor that we thought was growing has actually begun to shrink. The doctors can't explain it, but they're calling it a miracle." The stadium erupted in cheers and tears and pure, uncontainable joy. Sarah collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude and disbelief. Tommy, despite his exhaustion, managed to smile wider than he had since before his diagnosis. Later, medical experts would debate the cause of Tommy's unexpected improvement. Some attributed it to the advanced treatments he had been receiving. Others pointed to the power of hope and positive emotions on the human immune system. Dr. Martinez preferred a simpler explanation. Sometimes, when a child finds something worth fighting for that's bigger than themselves, their body finds reserves of strength that science can't measure. 6 months later, Tommy Reynolds walked across a stage to receive his elementary school diploma, his hair growing back in soft brown curls under the cowboy hat that had become his trademark. The foundation bearing his name had already funded breakthrough research at 5 major medical centers and had provided support to over 200 families dealing with pediatric cancer. George Strait had returned to touring, but now his concerts included a new tradition, a segment dedicated to the Tommy Reynolds Foundation, where children facing medical challenges were invited to join him on stage and share their stories. The connection between the country music legend and the boy who had reminded him of music's true power remained strong, with Tommy serving as an honorary board member of the foundation and George serving as an honorary grandfather figure in Tommy's life. Sarah Reynolds no longer worked 3 jobs. The foundation provided her with a position as family outreach coordinator, allowing her to help other parents navigate the overwhelming challenges of having a seriously ill child while spending quality time with her son. The story of Tommy Reynolds and George Strait became more than just a heartwarming tale about a wish come true. It became a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the belief that sometimes, when we reach out to help others, we end up healing ourselves. Tommy had set out to meet his hero and had ended up becoming a hero himself, proving that the smallest voices can sometimes create the biggest echoes. And on quiet evenings at the ranch, when the business of foundations and concerts and media attention faded away, George and Tommy could still be found on the front porch, guitars in hand, singing the songs that had brought them together and creating new melodies that would carry their friendship into whatever adventures lay ahead. The music, as Tommy had always known it would, continued to heal everything it touched.